Thank you very much for the opportunity to join you today at the conference. I've been part of it, but not all of it. What I wanted to do was, well, first of all, introduce myself. So, Morven Fancy, I work for Highlands and Highlands Enterprise. Many of you will know us. If not in the north, you'll know our sister organisation, Scottish Enterprise, and South of Scotland Enterprise. And my role in recent months and years has been to look a bit more closely at the housing system and the sector on the back of growing concerns and shortages that we have in the Highlands and Islands in particular. So I'm speaking broadly about rural Scotland, but obviously my knowledge and understanding comes very much from the north of the country. We've got a great panel here today who are going to contribute their thoughts on radical solutions for rural housing, or just views on how we can address the particular challenges we've got. But I thought I would start by just setting the scene from High's perspective, generally about where we are today. So it's maybe worth starting by saying and referencing Scott earlier, who talked about we are working in a context of what I believe is a broken housing system, and this need for a culture of transformation and an overhaul of the housing system stands there. We're not going to fix that today, but it is a backdrop to the issues that we're all facing, whether that's urban or rural. The geography of Scotland is such that I think we are transfixed by the economic powerhouse in the Central Belt, placing an overly huge reliance on the cities of Glasgow and Edinburgh, and to some extent Dundee and Aberdeen, to create the wealth that will power Scotland. And 4.1 million of Scotland's 5.4 million people live in that part of Scotland. So it's no wonder that early predictions using kind of economic migration indicators suggest that the Central Belt could become a megalopolis or super city over coming decades. It's this geographical imbalance that lies partly at the problems I think we now face in the provision of rural housing. While Scotland's population strategy that was launched in March 21 talked about proactively rebalancing Scotland's population, because it is a bizarre shape and a bizarre spread or dispersal of people in a country, there's no real signs of this being taken seriously. We're dealing with too many issues and problems now that we're not necessarily focusing on how do we get the balance right. The overheating cities versus in some places, depopulating rural. When you look at the daily announcements of new housing developments, which I do, there's barely a mention of rural Scotland, and the country seems to be obsessed with our cities and addressing homelessness. Not that that's not a problem, but whilst we've got invisible homelessness in our rural and island communities, remaining largely invisible. So young families, young people, and the not so young living in rural Scotland are looking often enviably at the plethora of houses being built in urban Scotland, houses of a variety and cost that they can only dream of in their rural location. A recent survey of young islanders by the Young Islanders Network showed that 72% of the young people surveyed have said that they think that they will have to leave their island when they're older due to a lack of available suitable housing. So that's built into young people from an early stage. So we're effectively experiencing forced out migration in many parts of the rural and island communities, often to fuel the growth of the urban economy, and housing lies at the centre of this problem. So as Scotland struggles with the housing emergency, and it's easy to overlook the rural housing crisis, populations are smaller, people are quieter and to some extent unrepresented, people are not necessarily on social housing registers. Housing need is so widely spread and dispersed that it's often lots of very small numbers. So I reckon across the Highlands and Islands right now, there are about 120 live rural and island-based community-led housing projects, most of which I would say are stuck somewhere, whether it's finance, infrastructure, planning, capacity. However, that all sounds very negative, and I don't mean it to, because it is a fantastic place to be, but looking more positively, the scale of jobs and economic growth across rural Scotland has never looked so good. Highlands and Islands Enterprise is 60 years old this year. In that time, we have seen the region's population rise by 23% to 470,000. against, I think, a Scottish increase of about 5%. And the current projected economic growth over the next 10 to 20 years is unprecedented. Major projects, major industries, mostly linked to renewable energy, onshore, offshore wind, pumped hydro projects, transformation of the grid, are investing heavily in infrastructure and projects, while the more traditional sectors such as aquaculture and hospitality are booming. Incidentally, when this transformation of our renewable energy system is completed, the north of Scotland, i.e. largely rural, will be responsible for delivering 40% of the UK's renewable energy. 40%. We're projecting over £100 billion of investment in the region and the requirement for over 25,000 additional workers over the next 10 to 15 years. So rural Scotland's been here before. The public forestry industry celebrated its centenary in 2019. When it was established, houses were built, communities were set up, alongside them with shops, amenities, schools, and an ever-growing network of families, all working in the forest industry and, of course, remaining there and doing other jobs afterwards. The 1940s and 50s saw major development of hydropower projects in rural Scotland. The hydro built houses in many rural locations in order to support the longer-term jobs associated with their work. In my part of the world, in Lochaber, linked to the hydropower, the aluminium factory was set up, massive housing developments were put in place to house workers, the setting up of the pulp and paper mills similarly resulted in more housing. Much of this would have been driven by the public sector as social housing at that time. Of course, not everything's the same as it was then. It's not to say that all the housing was good, although the majority of it, from what I can see, is still standing and being invested in and retrofitted to improve its energy efficiency. And some of these houses are currently being sold on the open market for well over £200,000. However, we're in a very different situation now in 2020s. Rising costs have made house building unviable in rural locations unless you're able to afford the £500,000 plus family home. And it certainly doesn't really fit with the affordability of people's wages. Many SME builders have disappeared since the financial crash of 2008, and access to public finance has become very difficult, and private finance. One of the questions I often ask myself is what's the role of businesses in addressing the housing of their workforce? If you're a business operating in the Central Belt right now, do you really have to consider building houses or contributing to the cost of housing for your staff? It sometimes feels like we are adding additional burdens onto businesses operating or relocating to rural Scotland. And this balance of striking what the businesses need versus what the community is, and the degree to which in the centre the community is the workforce of the future as well. However, there are increasing numbers of examples of businesses that are stepping into the space out of sheer necessity. We know that a major housing resort on the Isle of Arran has spent over £3.5 million on staff housing alone over the last number of years. That's money that's not being spent on that business, but it's just simply to house their staff. And we know that Highlands Coast Hotels have bought properties in Tongue, Kalescu, Brora, everywhere. So in some ways making things worse because they're expanding, but nonetheless creating the economies in these important rural coastlines. The Scottish salmon industry last year had a notification of 61 properties either owned or rented by fish farmers, which were providing accommodation for 130 colleagues in lots of very rural and island communities. Maui alone has helped to build some houses in Colonsay and Muck and Rum. So it's admirable to see those businesses stepping in, and many of these are stepping in partly because of the location that they have perhaps chosen to operate in, so they realise that the challenges are there. But still, it is a big challenge. So, and you'll hear shortly from SSAN. Who'll talk about their housing legacy strategy. So I have many questions, and we're working on the answers, but we're not quite there yet. And not all of these questions are necessarily being directed to our panellists today, but certainly just some food for thought. Is it morally acceptable to look upon rural Scotland as the provider of the renewable energy to power our cities and wider economy, and at the same time not address the needs of the very population that is central to this transformation? How are we going to address the current outflow of our young people in the rural island population by building many more houses? How do we do that at scale? And when I say scale, I don't mean 50 houses in a small village. I mean 50 houses spread over a 100-kilometre area of Wester Ross, for instance. How are we going to optimise the incoming workforce and encourage them to stay, to grow our population for the future? How are businesses going to be able to attract the workforce if they're unable to find accommodation? And how can we make building rural housing easier, more affordable, sustainable, quicker to build, and ensure that rural gets as much attention as the large numbers of urban housing developments, which is more attractive to the building sector for volume builders, but these builders don't exist in our part of the world. So maybe just to summarise, I think we have both the opportunity and the necessity to take a new and radical and innovative approach to creating sustainable rural housing. So I'm going to introduce the panel in the hope that they're able to provide some thoughts for not just ourselves in the panel, but for everybody that's joining the conference this afternoon. I'm going to introduce three individuals, Dermot Lawlor from Scottish Futures Trust, Gavin Miles from the Director of Planning and Place at the Cairngorm National Park, and Richard Jennings, the Housing Strategy Manager at SSEN and Transmission. I'm going to start with Dermot, if you are able to just come in and join us. Thank you.
Thanks, Morven. Thank you very much, everybody. Delighted to be here. I'm Dermot from Scottish Futures Trust. So I've got a few slides, Gail, I think, if you have them. If not, I can move on with that. Oh, thanks a million. Yeah, brilliant. Okay, so thanks, Morven, and thanks, everybody. Really delighted to be here. I think maybe just to kind of build on Morven's bit, just around that moral responsibility and the commitment to community and the commitment to rural. I guess just like to open up to kind of think about that idea of a broken system that provokes that question in the first place. So last year, the Dutch government came over to look at the good work that's happening in Scotland. And they went around and they were looking at cycle paths. So as an odd thing to do, come from the Netherlands, come over to Scotland, looking at cycle paths. And they identified that there were some really good examples of bits and pieces of cycle paths in bits and pieces of places that got you bits and pieces of somewhere. So they came over and they were saying, but in our system, we've got a centrally planned government which decides on what we want to do, and everybody does it, and it all connects up in a structural, systematic and coordinated kind of way. And they were kind of curious about Scotland. They went around, talked to people, met people, and they came up with an interesting observation around systems. They said, some of your systems seems broken, but you seem phenomenally world-class at relationship building and conversation. And I think that's maybe one of the ways to start. So if the system's broken, the question is, where do we put our attention now? Do we put our attention into more legislation, more finance and stuff? And yes, absolutely. But what we can do now is put much more investment into relationships and relationships with intent. So this is a diagram which has come out of Wester Ross, working with Morven and Ronnie from the colleagues, the Community Housing Trust and everywhere, which is looking at, okay, how do we leverage relationships to deal with the scale, the relevant scale for Wester Ross and other places taking an approach. The proposition was to address the needs of the community, to deal with that moral imperative. The first thing we need to do is to focus everybody in that relationship on creating resilient places. So not a housing problem, it's a community context. And everything we do needs to kind of wrap around that. The second key component of that, it's around integrated partnerships. So it's not necessarily about the business providing housing, but it might be providing equity for the housing or assurance around the housing, and the private sector and the public sector come together. So the two necessary conditions are around everybody focused on resilient places and integrated partnerships in the models they're in. And inside that, then, to get everybody to think the specific issues around housing, that we need housing for community and living well, as Scott talked about earlier. We need housing for workers and economy that might move through different phases and be repurposed. And the overlap of both of those housing investments needs to ensure that nobody feels isolated in those communities and that we reduce homelessness. So we can't have a good solution for one thing that provokes problems for the others. So relationships focus on, one, resilient places for everybody as the key criteria. 2, the behaviours around integrated partnerships. 3, the way that we do all of the housing is housing for living well, ensure that we've got housing for the economy, and that make sure that all of that comes together. And around that, then around a partnership to kind of organise in a geography, in a locality or in a region, so that the investment in the activities makes places work as opposed to delivers things. Secondly, inside of that, to leverage the capability of the partnership as a whole to make development easier, where possible, make it more affordable, and then also make the investment sustainable so that we retain the skills within the locality. We export the capabilities across the region. We look at and scale and adopt different methods of construction here and build it. So we use the solution to the problem as a way of scaling the skills, supporting the people, and widening community wealth. Next slide, please, Gail. So based on that, we've been kind of looking at this in 2 areas, on an urban area down in Granton as part of North Edinburgh, and looking at outcome-based financing, actually. So, and that's quite important because an outcome-based finance model needs, first of all, a bunch of people to come together through a relationship to define the outcomes. And then the second bit is to align every decision around that, around net zero, around child poverty, around the regeneration kind of piece. And so there's some work that's been going on around that. So that's the Granton side. And then we've adapted some of that to look at the more rural dimensions. We think that the housing component around that relationship model's got 3 bits. The first one is it's good to speak about relationships, but relationships work with commitment. And getting the commitment is not an easy thing. Morven's taken a powerful leadership role to try and cultivate relationships on the ground with communities, but also across institutions, private sector, and up onto the high rep bit itself. So getting commitment takes time, but it is the necessary condition for a partnership model. And inside that, the architecture of it is about getting leadership commitment at all levels. It's about getting people to pony up enough money to get going, to hire somebody to do the development work, and then leverage all of that. And it's about all of us having an honest discussion about the processes that we have and how we can nudge, push, and bash it around so we set the conditions for success. Architecture component 1 is commitment. Second bit is, with the commitment itself, you need to operationalize it and turn it into something we can do. And in the Wester Ross scenario, it was really interesting because there's lots of businesses and there's lots of communities doing bits, but it's often happening in bits and pieces. So an aggregated demand profile, just to understand what is the need of the business and the community and the homelessness all together as one big thing, and where is it and how much is it? So to not just talk about demand, but actually to look at the demand, the origin of demand, the aggregation of demand, the visualization of demand. So the first bit is a picture of where we are. Second bit is then to use that to shape the specific collaborations on specific dimensions of that. And then the third bit is a commitment to share capacity. So first bit of architecture is commitment. Second bit of architecture then is to make the alliance and the practice work for real. And then the third part was looking at how we then drive that into those issues of making development work, making it affordable, and capturing the skills. Some of that is around looking at the specification to make it easier, but also some of it is about nurturing and supporting the supply chain at the micro level and at the macro level, and bringing it together so that we're not looking at one size fits nowhere. We're actually looking at an ecosystem model, and to be intentional about that. Second one then is about investing in retention of the excellent construction skills that we have, and then layering on the adoption, the phased adoption, or the migration and change of things like modern methods of construction. So it's not an either or, it's about a blend. But the problem sometimes is we think that the one solution might be the best solution to solve it all, but on the ground it's a blend. So success is about thinking blend. And the final bit then is around, and this was for Ronnie McRae, who I know is working with Richard and others, was looking at if we can coordinate ourselves a little bit like the way the agricultural rings work around and buying big agricultural machinery or sharing risks on livestock, then we can coordinate how we purchase, what we purchase, and how we do it, and we can choose to purchase locally. So in terms of that bit around resilient places, integrated partnerships, and looking at the housing dimension of it, and architecture of that we're trying at the urban scale down in Granton, but also testing out at the rural scale, looks at building the commitment for real, that takes time, and it needs leaders like Morven, but also everybody on the call to say this is what we need to do and make it easier to get that commitment. Secondly, to operationalize the commitment into structures and frameworks of collaboration that might be place-based to allow places like Westeros and others to be able to deal with the benefits of scale and relationship. And then the third bit is to kind of look at how we bring things together at the big scale. So we coordinate at a big scale so that we're able to diversify and relate to the needs at the place scale. So bringing it back to the moral imperative as a nation is to get behind all communities in the nation. And that means different approaches in different places for different reasons. But the heart of that is around a relationship model in a broken system, and the components of that are around commitment, alliance, and product. Thanks, Morven.
Thanks very much, Dermot. A lot in there, and thank you for that. And we've had a number of discussions about the challenges that sit behind all this, so I'm sure we can pick that up in the panel discussion when we get to that. Thank you.